I was asked to speak about the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, or the OIC, and its efforts to stifle free speech. So first, who is the OIC? The OIC is the second largest international organization in the world, behind only the UN. It is the largest Islamic organization in the world, claiming to represent 1.5 billion Muslims around the world. It's comprised of 56 Muslim-majority UN member states, plus the Palestinian Authority, and they tend to vote together as a bloc. So they're absolutely the largest voting bloc in the Human Rights Council, and they're arguably the largest voting bloc in the UN as a whole. The OIC holds itself out as a moderate organization, but in fact, it's an Islamist supremacist organization whose goal is the implementation of Sharia law worldwide. Toward that end, it introduces UN resolutions, excuse me, it introduces UN resolutions that would clamp down on free speech that criticizes Islam. Its ultimate goal would be the international criminalization of anything to do with Muslims, Islam, Sharia law, Islamic theocracies, and even Islamic terrorism. Knowing that this can't occur overnight, it introduces the language in a watered-down form in order to achieve its goals gradually and incrementally. Under the guise of responsible speech, sensitive speech, or politically correct speech, what the OIC really wants to do is to stifle your freedom of speech. The first resolution I'm going to discuss with you today is called Combating Defamation of Religions. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the concept, what it does is it gives an idea or a religion, in this case Islam, protection from criticism, as opposed to what we have in the American legal system, which is defamation protections for an individual or group of individuals. So you have defamation of an idea or a religion versus defamation of people. Additionally, in the American legal system, in order for something to be defamatory, it has to be a false statement of fact. Truth is a defense. If you say something bad about someone, no matter how terrible it is, if it's true or mere opinion, it's not defamatory. By stark contrast, if the OIC's definition of defamation includes anything that sheds a negative light on Islam or Muslims, even if it's true, and even if it's mere opinion. Taking that a step further, it also includes anything that would violate Islamic blasphemy codes. So, for example, in Islam it's prohibited to draw depictions of the Muslim prophet Muhammad. If you do that, even if you show him in a positive light, that's blasphemy, and the OIC would consider it defamation as well. Though the resolution is called Defamation of Religions, in its implementation and the OIC's interpretation, it applies only to Islam. Believe me, there is absolutely no reciprocity for anti-Jewish, anti-Christian, or anti-Israel hate speech. In fact, the OIC supports Hamas, it supports Iran's nuclear program, and it rationalizes 9/11. At a certain point, this resolution was introduced in 1999 into the UN. And it passed in various UN bodies every single year, through and including 2010. At a certain point, the U.S. realized that it had potentially dire consequences for freedom of expression. So in 2011, the State Department asked the OIC to produce an alternative resolution that would retain free speech and still address the OIC's concerns about alleged Islamophobia. The result was Resolution 1618 to combat intolerance based on religion or belief. I'll just call it Resolution 1618. Both the State Department and numerous Christian organizations fully supported this resolution because they believed that the resolution was moving from protecting an idea or a religion to protecting religious minorities based on discrimination and violence. So isn't that great? It would be if it were true, but let's look at it a little more closely. The resolution definitely drops the phrase defamation of religions and focuses on intolerance, negative stereotyping, and incitement to discrimination or violence. But the resolution is still problematic, and I'm going to focus on two clauses in particular. First, and pay attention to my language, it condemns the advocacy of hatred that amounts to incitement to hostility, discrimination, or violence, and asks states to take effective action against it. So the issue is going to be, one of the issues is going to be, what is the definition of incitement? And there's ample reason to believe that criticism of Islam, in other words, defamation of religions, will constitute the advocacy of hatred that is tantamount to the condemned incitement. The second clause I want to point out is that it asks governments to counter religious profiling for purposes of law enforcement. So how is the resolution defining religious profiling? It is, quote, the invidious use of a criterion for purposes of questioning, interrogations, investigations, and searches. So notice, nobody's saying that you can't use religion as the sole criterion. That's not the issue. No one's saying, oh, you're Muslim, we want to lock you up. This resolution says you can't use religion as one factor on a list of other elements to consider. In short, this resolution drops the defamation of religion's language and replaces it with European hate speech style language. But there are parts of it that are still open to interpretation, and the OIC has made it very clear that it has not dropped its defamation of religion's goal. Excuse me. In July of 2011, Hillary Clinton attended a high-level meeting on Islamophobia held in Istanbul, Turkey. At that meeting, she announced to the world that the State Department would host a meeting to move to implementation Resolution 1618. That implementation process is known as the Istanbul process. The resolution, she did have this meeting, and it was held in December of 2011. It consisted of a 3-day conference, which was held primarily behind closed doors. Approximately 30 countries and international organizations attended, including the OIC and the EU. But if, in fact, the State Department really did have a concern about retaining free expression at the time of the passage of the resolution, then by the time the conference came, the entire focus shifted to protecting religious minorities, and in fact, specifically to protecting Muslims in the West, who are obviously fairly free and equal, as opposed to the truly aggrieved non-Muslims in the OIC countries. Reports coming out of that conference indicate that the entire conference had an anti-Western and an anti-American bent. And while Hillary Clinton chose not to push for the enactment of speech-restrictive laws, such as European hate speech style laws, at least for this round, and she gave lip service to the virtues of free speech, she also quickly followed it up by saying that, quote, the U.S. advocates for other measures to achieve the same effect, unquote. Those other measures included interfaith dialogue and, quote, the good old-fashioned techniques of peer pressure and shaming, unquote. Hillary Clinton seems to have a fundamental misunderstanding of the First Amendment. The First Amendment was designed to encourage robust political debate and to flesh out minority viewpoints. It wasn't designed so that some people could use their free speech rights to tell other people to shut up, because that's a more effective means to silence them than passing speech restrictive laws. I assume that most of you in this audience support the notion of free speech. But even if you don't, I ask you, is it the proper role of the State Department to use peer pressure and shaming to silence Americans with whom it disagrees? I think not. Instead of working with the OIC to restrict freedom of speech, America should be leading the charge to establish freedom of speech worldwide, equivalent to the United States Constitution's First Amendment. We should be condemning the human rights violations of those to whom this administration is currently capitulating, including Saudi Arabia and Iran. And finally, and I cannot stress this enough, free speech constitutes a human right. Its restriction in the form of combating defamation of religions does not. In fact, the idea is a totally concocted idea that stands in direct opposition to real human rights. Only people should be afforded human rights. Ideas, policies, and religions ought not get protection from criticism. Resolutions like this, like the ones I've discussed with you today, and the other one I didn't have time to talk about that this administration co-drafted with Mubarak, harm free speech rights they harm religious freedom rights, they harm human rights, they harm national security, and they harm terrorism prevention efforts. Yet, the OIC is constantly using cries of Islamophobia in order to claim victimhood as a means to gain support for their anti-freedom measures. The OIC repeatedly asserts that Islamophobia is one of the greatest threats to world peace and global security, rather than concluding that perhaps Islamophobia is the result of the actions taken of a radical Islamist movement around the world. In conclusion, I want to say that we cannot allow the OIC to take the shield of religious freedom and use it as a sword of state censorship. America is the last bastion of freedom and the best hope of mankind. We should be holding ourselves up as a role model for freedom, equality, and human rights instead of exalting the Islamist enemies of freedom that constitute the Organization of Islamic Cooperation.